The small town of Maplewood, nestled in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. As dusk settled over the quiet streets, long shadows stretched across the train tracks that wound their way through the outskirts of town. The air hung heavy with the promise of summer, carrying the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and blooming wildflowers. Matthew Carter, a dedicated high school history teacher, was driving home after a long day at work. His beat-up Ford pickup truck rumbled along the familiar roads, the radio playing softly in the background. At 42, Matthew's face bore the lines of a man who had seen his fair share of hardship, but his kind brown eyes still held a spark of warmth and compassion. As he approached the railroad crossing, Matthew's mind wandered to thoughts of his late wife, Sarah. It had been 2 years since cancer had taken her, leaving him to raise their teenage daughter, Patricia, alone. The weight of her absence still pressed heavily on his heart, making even the most mundane tasks feel like monumental challenges. Lost in his memories, Matthew almost missed the faint sound that cut through the evening air. It was a high-pitched whimper, barely audible over the hum of his truck's engine. Furrowing his brow, he slowed down, his eyes scanning the area around the tracks. That's when he saw her, a golden retriever, her fur matted and dirty, struggling against ropes that bound her to the railroad ties. Matthew's heart leaped into his throat as he slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. Without a second thought, he flung open the door and sprinted towards the tracks, his feet pounding against the gravel. As he drew closer, he could see that the dog wasn't alone. Huddled close to her were 3 tiny puppies, their eyes wide with fear, their tiny bodies trembling. "Oh my God," Matthew breathed, dropping to his knees beside the frightened animals. The mother dog, despite her obvious distress, managed to thump her tail weakly against the ground, her brown eyes pleading for help. Matthew's hands shook as he worked to untie the ropes, his fingers fumbling with the tight knots. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, trying to keep his voice calm despite the panic rising in his chest. "I'm going to get you out of here." As if on cue, a distant rumble began to build, growing louder with each passing second. Matthew's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he saw the telltale lights of an approaching train in the distance. His heart pounded furiously against his ribs as he redoubled his efforts, working frantically to free the trapped animals. The train's horn blared, a deafening warning that sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through Matthew's body. He could feel the vibrations of the approaching locomotive through the ground, each second bringing it closer and closer. With a burst of desperate strength, he finally managed to loosen the last knot, freeing the mother dog from her bonds. "Come on," he shouted, scooping up 2 of the puppies in his arms. The mother dog, understanding the urgency of the situation, gently grabbed the 3rd puppy by the scruff of its neck. Together, they scrambled away from the tracks, Matthew's legs pumping as hard as they could. They had barely made it to safety when the train thundered past, the rush of air whipping at their backs. Matthew stumbled, falling to his knees on the grassy embankment, clutching the puppies to his chest. The mother dog collapsed beside him, her sides heaving as she gently set down her puppy. For a long moment, Matthew sat there, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality of what had just happened washed over him. He had saved them. By some miracle, he had managed to rescue this little family from certain death. As the train disappeared into the distance, the sudden silence was broken by the soft whimpers of the puppies. Matthew looked down at the tiny bundles of fur in his arms, their eyes squeezed shut as they nuzzled against him for warmth and comfort. The mother dog, exhausted but alert, watched him warily, her maternal instincts still on high alert. "It's okay," Matthew said softly, slowly extending his hand for the mother to sniff. "You're safe now. I won't hurt you." The dog hesitated for a moment before tentatively licking his fingers, her tail giving a cautious wag. Matthew smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a feeling of purpose, of having made a real difference in the world. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Matthew's mind raced with questions. Who could have done such a cruel thing? How long had these poor animals been out here? He pushed the thoughts aside for now, focusing on the immediate needs of the dogs. "Let's get you guys somewhere safe," he said, carefully gathering the puppies in his arms. The mother dog, still weak from her ordeal, struggled to her feet. Matthew's heart ached at the sight of her trembling legs. "Come on, girl. It's not far. Slowly, they made their way back to Matthew's truck. He created a makeshift bed in the back seat using an old blanket he kept for emergencies. Gently, he placed the puppies on the blanket, watching as the mother dog climbed in after them, curling her body protectively around her babies. As Matthew slid into the driver's seat, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his usually neatly combed hair a wild mess. But there was something else there too, a light in his eyes that had been missing for far too long. The drive home was a blur, Matthew's mind whirling with plans and worries. He knew he couldn't just drop these dogs off at a shelter. After what they'd been through, they needed care and attention. Besides, something about this little family had touched his heart in a way he couldn't quite explain. As he pulled into the driveway of his modest two-story home, Matthew caught sight of his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, watering her prized rose bushes. The elderly woman paused, her eyebrows rising in surprise as she watched Matthew carefully lift the mother dog from the back seat. "Matthew Carter, what on earth?" she called out, setting down her watering can and making her way to the fence that separated their yards. Matthew gave her a sheepish smile as he gently set the mother dog down on the grass. "It's a long story, Mrs. Henderson. I found them tied to the railroad tracks out by Miller's Creek." Mrs. Henderson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. "Good Lord! Who would do such a thing?" "I don't know," Matthew replied, his jaw tightening as he thought about the cruelty these animals had endured. "But they're safe now." As if on cue, one of the puppies let out a tiny bark from inside the truck. Mrs. Henderson's face softened, a smile spreading across her wrinkled features. "Well, aren't you just a regular hero, Matthew? Sarah would be proud of you." The mention of his late wife sent a pang through Matthew's heart, but it was accompanied by a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate that." As Matthew carried the puppies inside, followed closely by their watchful mother, he couldn't help but feel like this was the beginning of something important. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. Little did Matthew know, this act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life but the lives of everyone in Maplewood. As he settled the dogs into a cozy corner of his living room, providing them with water and some leftover chicken from his fridge, Matthew had no idea that his simple act of heroism was the first step on a journey that would heal old wounds, forge new connections, and remind an entire community of the power of compassion and second chances. The rest of the evening passed in a flurry of activity as Matthew did his best to make his unexpected guests comfortable. He made a quick trip to the local pet store, returning with puppy food, bowls, and a few toys. As he watched the mother dog, whom he had started calling Goldie, tend to her puppies, Matthew felt a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in years, his house felt alive again, filled with the soft sounds of puppy snores and the gentle padding of Goldie's paws as she kept a watchful eye on her babies. As Matthew finally settled into bed that night, his mind buzzing with plans for the following day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had changed. Little did he know, the real challenges, and the true miracles, were yet to come. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Matthew's living room, casting a warm glow on the makeshift bed he had created for Goldie and her puppies. As he padded quietly into the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Matthew couldn't help but smile at the sight before him. Goldie lay curled protectively around her 3 puppies, her golden fur shimmering in the soft light. "Good morning, girl," Matthew said softly, kneeling down to gently stroke Goldie's head. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the blanket, her brown eyes regarding Matthew with a mixture of gratitude and lingering wariness. As Matthew prepared breakfast for his unexpected houseguests, his mind wandered to the events of the previous evening. The memory of finding Goldie and her puppies tied to the railroad tracks still sent a chill down his spine. Who could have done such a cruel thing? And why? These questions nagged at him as he poured kibble into a bowl for Goldie and prepared a warm milk mixture for the puppies. He knew he needed to find answers, not just for his own peace of mind, but to ensure that something like this wouldn't happen again. After ensuring that Goldie and her puppies were comfortable and fed, Matthew made a decision. He would take them to the local veterinarian, Dr. Anderson, for a checkup. Not only would it ensure the dogs were healthy, but it might also provide some clues about their background. As Matthew gathered the puppies into a large, soft-sided carrier and coaxed Goldie onto a leash, he heard the familiar sound of his daughter's bedroom door opening upstairs. Patricia's footsteps echoed through the house as she made her way down the stairs, her pace slowing as she reached the living room. "Dad!" Patricia's voice was thick with sleep, her long dark hair tousled from a restless night. "What's going on?" Matthew turned to face his daughter, a small smile playing on his lips. "We have some guests, Patricia. I found them last night on my way home." Patricia's eyes widened as she took in the sight of Goldie and the carrier full of squirming puppies. For a moment, Matthew saw a flicker of something in her eyes: surprise? Guilt? But it was gone so quickly he wondered if he had imagined it. "I'm taking them to Dr. Anderson for a checkup," Matthew explained, grabbing his car keys from the hook by the door. "Want to come along?" Patricia hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her oversized sleep shirt. I can't, Dad. I promised to meet some friends this morning." Matthew nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. Ever since Sarah's death, Patricia had become increasingly distant, spending more and more time with her friends and less at home. He missed the close relationship they once had, but he didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between them. "All right, honey. Have a good time," he said, managing a smile. "There's cereal in the pantry if you're hungry." As Matthew loaded Goldie and the puppies into his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Patricia. Her reaction to the dogs had been strange. But he pushed the thought aside as he pulled out of the driveway, focusing instead on the task at hand. The drive to Dr. Anderson's clinic was short, the streets of Maplewood still quiet in the early morning hours. As Matthew pulled into the parking lot, he noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the entrance, their laughter carrying across the nearly empty lot. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized one of the voices. Patricia. But hadn't she said she was meeting friends later? Careful not to startle Goldie, Matthew climbed out of the truck, his eyes fixed on the group of teens. And there, in the center of the group, was Patricia. Her face was animated as she talked with her friends, a carefree smile on her face that Matthew hadn't seen in months. As Matthew approached, carrier in one hand and Goldie's leash in the other, the laughter died away. Patricia's face drained of color as she caught sight of her father, her eyes darting between him and the dogs. "Patricia." Matthew's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of confusion and hurt. "I thought you were meeting your friends later." The other teens shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One boy, taller than the rest with shaggy blonde hair, stepped forward. Matthew recognized him as Jason, one of Patricia's classmates. "Mr. Carter," Jason began, his voice cracking slightly. "We can explain." But before Jason could continue, Dr. Anderson emerged from the clinic, her face lighting up at the sight of Matthew and the dogs. "Matthew, what brings you here so early?" she asked, her eyes widening as she took in Goldie's bedraggled appearance and the carrier full of puppies. In that moment, Matthew made a decision. Whatever was going on with Patricia and her friends, it could wait. The health and safety of Goldie and her puppies had to come first. "Found these little ones in a bit of trouble last night, Doc," Matthew explained, following Dr. Anderson into the clinic. He shot a meaningful look at Patricia and her friends. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the door of the clinic closed behind him, Matthew took a deep breath, trying to center himself. The examination room was bright and clean, the familiar smell of antiseptic filling the air. Dr. Anderson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, knelt down to examine Goldie. "You said you found them in trouble?" she asked, her hands gently probing Goldie's body for any signs of injury. Matthew nodded, recounting the events of the previous night. As he spoke, Dr. Anderson's face grew increasingly grave. "Tied to the railroad tracks," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I've seen some cruel things in my time, but this..." As Dr. Anderson continued her examination, moving on to check the puppies, Matthew's mind wandered back to Patricia and her friends. The guilty looks on their faces, their obvious discomfort. A sinking feeling settled in the pit of his stomach as a horrible suspicion began to take shape. Well, all things considered, They're in remarkably good health. Dr. Anderson's voice pulled Matthew back to the present. Goldie is a bit undernourished and dehydrated, and she has some minor abrasions from the ropes, but nothing that won't heal with proper care. The puppies seem to be about 6 weeks old, and they're all doing well. Matthew nodded, relief washing over him. That's good news. Document. Thank you. As Dr. Anderson prescribed a course of treatment and gave Matthew instructions for the dog's care, he couldn't help but glance out the window. Patricia and her friends were still there, huddled together in intense conversation. Matthew, Dr. Anderson's voice was gentle but firm. Is everything all right? You seem distracted. For a moment, Matthew considered confiding in her, sharing his suspicions about Patricia's involvement. But he held back. He needed to talk to his daughter first, to understand what had happened. Just worried about the dogs, he said instead, forcing a smile. It's been a long time since I've taken care of puppies. Dr. Anderson patted his shoulder reassuringly. You're doing a good thing, Matthew. These dogs are lucky you found them. As Matthew settled the bill and gathered up Goldie and the puppies, he steeled himself for the conversation to come. The morning sun was now high in the sky, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread settling in Matthew's stomach. Outside, Patricia and her friends fell silent as Matthew approached. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia, Matthew said, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk. You and your friends. The teens exchanged nervous glances, shuffling their feet and avoiding Matthew's gaze. Patricia looked like she wanted to run, her face a mixture of fear and defiance. Dad, she began, but Matthew cut her off with a raised hand. Not here, he said, nodding towards the truck. Let's go home. All of you. As the teens piled into the back of Matthew's truck, with Patricia in the passenger seat, an uncomfortable silence settled over them. Goldie, sensing the tension, whined softly from her place in the back seat. The drive home was the longest 5 minutes of Matthew's life. His mind raced with questions, scenarios playing out in his head. How could Patricia, his sweet, compassionate daughter, have been involved in something so cruel? What had gone so wrong that she would participate in such an act? As they pulled into the driveway of the Carter home, Matthew took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. He knew that the conversation they were about to have would change everything. But as he looked at the frightened, guilty faces of the teens, he also knew that this was an opportunity. A chance to teach a powerful lesson about compassion, responsibility, and the consequences of our actions. Little did Matthew know, this confrontation would be the catalyst for a journey of healing and growth, not just for Patricia and her friends, but for the entire community of Maplewood. As he led the Samba group into the house, Goldie and her puppies safely settled in the living room, Matthew steeled himself for the difficult conversation ahead. The truth was about to come out, and with it, the first steps towards redemption and understanding. The living room of the Carter house was thick with tension as Matthew faced the group of teenagers. Patricia sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor, while her friends, Jason, Emily, and Tyler, huddled together on the love seat. The soft whimpers of the puppies from their makeshift bed in the corner seemed to underscore the gravity of the situation. Matthew took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I think it's time you all explained exactly what happened, he said, his voice calm but firm. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Jason cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, it was just supposed to be a prank, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. We never meant for it to go this far. A prank? Matthew repeated, disbelief coloring his tone. Tying up a mother dog and her puppies on railroad tracks is a prank to you? Patricia flinched at her father's words, a tear sliding down her cheek. We were stupid, she mumbled. We thought it would be funny to scare Mrs. Johnson's dog. You know how she's always yelling at us to stay off her lawn. Emily, a petite girl with glasses, nodded vigorously. We were going to untie them right away, honest. But then we heard the train coming, and we panicked. The room fell silent as the weight of their actions settled over everyone. Matthew closed his eyes, taking a moment to process what he'd heard. When he opened them again, his gaze swept over each of the teens, lingering on his daughter. Do you understand what could have happened? He asked, his voice low and intense. "If I hadn't come along when I did, Goldie and her puppies would be dead. Your prank could have resulted in the death of innocent animals." The teens shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Matthew's eyes. Tyler, a stocky boy with a crew cut, spoke up. "We're really sorry, Mr. Carter. We never wanted anyone to get hurt." Matthew nodded slowly, considering his next words carefully. He could see the genuine remorse on their faces, the fear and shame in their eyes. These weren't bad kids, he realized. They were just young, impulsive, and hadn't thought through the consequences of their actions. "I believe you're sorry," he said finally. "But being sorry isn't enough. You need to take responsibility for what you've done and make it right." Patricia looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but hopeful. "How?" she asked, her voice small. Matthew glanced at Goldie and her puppies, an idea forming in his mind. "You're going to help me take care of them," he said. "All of you. Every day, after school and on weekends, you'll be here, feeding them, cleaning up after them, training them. You'll learn what it means to be responsible for another life." The teens exchanged uncertain glances. "For how long?" Jason asked. "Until they're ready to be adopted," Matthew replied. "Which, given their age, will be at least another 6 weeks. There were a few groans and mumbled protests, but Matthew held up a hand to silence them. "This isn't negotiable," he said firmly. "It's this, or I call your parents and the police. Your choice." The room was quiet for a moment as the teens absorbed Matthew's words. Then, one by one, they nodded their agreement. "Good," Matthew said, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he hoped that this experience would teach these kids valuable lessons about compassion, responsibility, and the consequences of their actions. The next day marked the beginning of their unusual arrangement. After school, Patricia and her friends trudged into the Carter house, backpacks slung over their shoulders and uncertainty written on their faces. Matthew was waiting for them, a stack of puppy care books on the coffee table and a list of chores pinned to the refrigerator. "All right, team," he said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. "Let's get started." The first few days were challenging, to say the least. The teens struggled with the mundane tasks of feeding, cleaning, and playing with the dogs. Patricia, in particular, seemed to have difficulty connecting with the animals. She went through the motions, but her movements were mechanical, her eyes distant. Matthew watched his daughter with growing concern. He knew that Patricia was still grappling with her own grief over her mother's death, emotions that had been compounded by the guilt of her recent actions. He wanted to reach out to her, to bridge the gap that had grown between them, but he wasn't sure how. As the days turned into weeks, however, a subtle shift began to occur. The teens started to arrive at the house with more energy, their conversations punctuated by laughter as they shared stories of the puppies' antics. Even Patricia began to show signs of warming up to the dogs. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into their arrangement, Matthew came home from work to find Patricia sitting on the living room floor, one of the puppies, a small, golden-furred bundle of energy, curled up in her lap. She was stroking its fur gently, a small smile playing on her lips. "That one seems to have taken a liking to you," Matthew said softly, not wanting to startle her. Patricia looked up, her smile widening slightly. "Yeah," she said. "I've been calling him Sonny. Is that okay?" Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. It was the first time in months that Patricia had voluntarily shared something with him. "It's perfect," he said, sitting down beside her. "Your mom always loved sunny days." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Then Patricia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss her, Dad. I miss her so much." Matthew wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. "I know, sweetheart. I miss her too." As Patricia leaned into her father's embrace, Sonny nestled deeper into her lap, letting out a contented sigh. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, both human and canine, something began to heal in both their hearts. The transformation in the teens continued as the weeks passed. Jason, who had initially been the most reluctant, became Goldie's staunch defender. He spent hours researching dog training techniques and was determined to teach her new tricks. Emily, with her quiet, nurturing nature, took charge of the puppies' socialization. She organized puppy playdates with other dogs in the neighborhood, ensuring that the little ones grew up to be well-adjusted and friendly. Tyler, to everyone's surprise, turned out to have a knack for grooming. He took great pride in keeping Goldie and her puppies clean and well-groomed, even going so far as to create a puppy spa day complete with gentle baths and careful nail trimmings. As for Patricia, her bond with Sunny grew stronger each day. She often stayed late after the others had gone home, curled up on the couch with the puppy, talking to him in a soft voice about her day, her fears, her hopes. Matthew would sometimes overhear snippets of these one-sided conversations, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and sadness for his daughter. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting a warm glow over the living room, Matthew found Patricia sitting on the back porch, Sunny dozing in her lap. He sat down beside her, handing her a mug of hot chocolate. "Thanks, Dad," she said, taking a sip. After a moment of silence, she spoke again. "I've been thinking about what we did. About Goldie and the puppies." Matthew waited patiently, giving her space to gather her thoughts. "It was so stupid," Patricia continued, her voice thick with emotion. They could have died. And for what? A stupid prank." She looked up at her father, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "How could I have been so cruel?" Matthew put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We all make mistakes, Patricia," he said gently. "The important thing is that you've learned from it. You're not the same person you were a few weeks ago." Patricia nodded, absently stroking Sunny's fur. "I want to do more," she said. "To make up for what we did. Maybe we could volunteer at the animal shelter. All of us." Matthew felt a surge of pride at his daughter's words. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "We can look into it tomorrow." As they sat there, watching the sky turn from orange to deep blue, Matthew realized that something fundamental had shifted. The path to redemption was not always easy or straightforward, but with compassion, understanding, and a willingness to learn and grow, it was always possible. The weeks that followed saw the Carter house become a hub of activity. Not only were Patricia and her friends there daily to care for Goldie and the puppies, but they also began planning their volunteer work at the local animal shelter. The living room often echoed with the sound of their excited voices as they discussed fundraising ideas and ways to help other animals in need. Matthew watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. What had started as a punishment, a way to teach these kids about responsibility, had blossomed into something much more profound. They were learning empathy, compassion, and the joy that comes from helping others. As the day approached when Goldie and her puppies would be ready for adoption, Matthew couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had all taken. The path to redemption was not always easy, but watching these young people grow and change, he knew that it was always worth it. Little did he know, the greatest challenges, and the most profound transformations, were yet to come. The story of Goldie and her puppies had touched something deep in the heart of Maplewood, and its ripples were about to spread far beyond the walls of the Carter home. As the weeks passed, the Carter house became a hub of activity and laughter, a stark contrast to the quiet, somber atmosphere that had pervaded it for so long. The daily routine of caring for Goldie and her puppies had brought an unexpected vibrancy back into Matthew and Patricia's lives, and the positive effects were beginning to ripple outward, touching the lives of Patricia's friends and the broader community of Maplewood. One sunny Saturday morning, Matthew stood in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and watching through the window as Patricia and her friends played with the puppies in the backyard. The sound of their laughter drifted in through the open window, a melody he hadn't realized how much he'd missed. Jason was attempting to teach Goldie a new trick, his face a picture of concentration as he held up a treat, encouraging her to roll over. Emily and Tyler were taking turns throwing a small ball for two of the puppies, cheering enthusiastically whenever one of them managed to catch it. And Patricia. Matthew's heart swelled as he watched his daughter. She was sitting cross-legged on the grass, Sunny curled up in her lap, a look of contentment on her face that he hadn't seen in years. As he observed the scene, Matthew felt a bittersweet pang. Sarah would have loved this, he thought. She always wanted the house to be full of life and laughter. The thought of his late wife no longer brought just pain, but a mixture of sadness and warm nostalgia. He realized that, for the first time since her passing, he was able to think of her without feeling overwhelmed by grief. Later that afternoon, as the teens were finishing up their chores, Matthew overheard a conversation that made him pause outside the living room door. "You know," Emily was saying, her voice thoughtful, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually glad Mr. Carter made us do this." There was a murmur of agreement from the others. "Yeah," Jason chimed in. "I mean, it sucked at first, but I don't know. It feels good, you know? Like we're actually doing something that matters." "I get what you mean," Tyler added. "My little sister asked me the other day why I'm always smiling now. I didn't even realize I was doing it." There was a moment of silence, and then Patricia spoke, her voice soft but clear. I think this is the first time since my mom died that I've felt like things might be okay again." Matthew felt his throat tighten with emotion. He wanted to rush in, to hug his daughter and tell her how proud he was of her, how much he loved her. But he held back, knowing that this moment of vulnerability and connection between the friends was important. Instead, he quietly retreated to the kitchen, giving them their privacy. As he busied himself preparing snacks for the group, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The punishment he had devised for the teens had become something so much more meaningful than he could have ever anticipated. That evening, after Patricia's friends had gone home and the dogs were settled for the night, Matthew found Patricia sitting on the back porch steps, gazing up at the stars. He sat down beside her, handing her a mug of hot chocolate, a small tradition they had recently revived. "Thanks, Dad," Patricia said, taking the mug with a small smile. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the chirping of crickets providing a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Finally, Patricia spoke. "Dad," she said, her voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Matthew turned to look at her, noting the serious expression on her face. "Of course, sweetheart. You can ask me anything." Patricia took a deep breath. Do you think Mom would be disappointed in me? For what we did to Goldie and the puppies?" Matthew felt his heart clench at the question. He took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. "Patricia," he began gently, "your mom loved you more than anything in this world. And one of the things she always admired most about you was your capacity for growth and learning." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you did was wrong, there's no denying that. But the way you've taken responsibility for your actions, the way you've worked to make things right, that's what matters. That's what your mom would be proud of." Patricia nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I miss her so much, Dad," she whispered. "Sometimes I feel guilty for being happy, for laughing with my friends or enjoying time with Sunny. Like I'm betraying her memory or something." Matthew wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Your mom would want nothing more than for you to be happy. She'd be overjoyed to see you laughing and enjoying life again." As Patricia leaned into her father's embrace, the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. Matthew held her tightly, his own cheeks wet with silent tears. It was a moment of shared grief, but also of healing, a chance for father and daughter to reconnect and support each other in their ongoing journey of recovery. The next few days saw a subtle but significant shift in the dynamics of the Carter household. Patricia began to open up more, sharing stories about her day at school or funny anecdotes about the puppy's antics. Matthew, in turn, found himself talking more about Sarah, sharing memories that brought smiles to both their faces rather than just pain. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Patricia paused, a dish towel in her hand. "Hey, Dad," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I was thinking, maybe we could invite my friends over for dinner sometime? Like, not just to take care of the dogs, but, to hang out." Matthew felt a surge of warmth in his chest. It was a small thing, but it represented a huge step forward in their relationship. "I think that's a great idea," he said, smiling. "How about this Friday?" Patricia's face lit up. "Really? That would be awesome." As they finalized their plans, Matthew couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. The house that had once felt so empty and silent was now filled with the promise of laughter and friendship. Friday evening arrived, and the Carter house was buzzing with activity. The aroma of Matthew's famous lasagna filled the air as Patricia and her friends set the table, their chatter and laughter creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. As they all sat down to eat, Matthew looked around the table, taking in the scene. Jason was animatedly describing his latest success in training Goldie, while Emily and Tyler debated the merits of different dog breeds. Patricia, seated next to her father, was laughing at something Jason had said, her eyes bright and her smile genuine. In that moment, Matthew felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. These kids, who had started out as reluctant participants in what they saw as a punishment, had become an integral part of their lives. They had brought light back into his home and helped his daughter find her way back to happiness. As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from school gossip to their plans for the upcoming animal shelter fundraiser. Matthew found himself enjoying the company of these young people, their energy and enthusiasm infectious. Later, as he was clearing the dishes, Matthew overheard Patricia talking to her friends in the living room. "Guys," she was saying, her voice serious. "I just wanted to say, thanks. For everything. I know we started this whole thing because we messed up, but I don't know. It's like it gave us a second chance, you know?" There was a murmur of agreement from the others. "Yeah," Jason said. "Who would have thought that tying up those dogs would end up being the best mistake we ever made?" "Don't say it like that," Emily admonished, but there was no real heat in her words. "But I get what you mean. It's like, we did this terrible thing, but instead of it ruining everything, it gave us a chance to become better people." Matthew leaned against the kitchen counter, letting their words wash over him. He thought about the long, difficult journey they had all been on, from that fateful night at the railroad tracks to this moment of warmth and camaraderie in his living room. The path to healing was rarely straightforward, he reflected. Sometimes it took unexpected turns, leading you to places you never thought you'd go. But as he listened to the laughter and conversation flowing from the other room, Matthew knew that they were all on the right track. The wounds that had seemed so raw and painful just a few months ago were beginning to heal. There would always be scars, of course, the loss of Sarah, the memory of their misguided prank, but those scars were now a part of their story, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had grown. As Matthew rejoined the group in the living room, Goldie padded over to him, resting her head on his knee. He scratched behind her ears, marveling at how this gentle creature, who had suffered so much at their hands, had become the catalyst for so much positive change. The evening wound down, with Patricia's friends reluctantly gathering their things to head home. As Matthew stood at the door, watching them walk down the driveway, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead might not always be easy, but he knew now that they didn't have to walk it alone. Closing the door, he turned to find Patricia standing in the hallway, a soft smile on her face. "That was really nice, Dad," she said. "Thanks for everything." Matthew pulled his daughter into a hug, feeling the warmth of her embrace and the strength of their renewed bond. "Anytime, sweetheart," he murmured. "Anytime." As they stood there, the sound of Goldie's tail thumping against the floor and the soft whimpers of the puppies in their bed created a soothing backdrop. In that moment, Matthew knew that while the wounds of the past might never fully disappear, they had found a way to move forward, together. The healing process was far from over, but with each passing day, each shared laugh, each small victory in caring for Goldie and her puppies, they were writing a new chapter in their lives. And for the first time in a long while, Matthew found himself looking forward to what the future might bring. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation in Patricia and her friends became increasingly evident. What had started as a mandatory task to care for Goldie and her puppies had blossomed into a genuine passion for animal welfare and a deeper understanding of compassion and responsibility. One crisp Saturday morning, Matthew walked into the living room to find Patricia hunched over her laptop, surrounded by notebooks and scribbled-on scraps of paper. Goldie lay at her feet, her tail thumping gently against the floor. "What's all this, sweetheart?" Matthew asked, gesturing to the organized chaos around his daughter. Patricia looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. "Oh, hey Dad. I'm working on a fundraiser idea for the animal shelter. Remember how we talked about volunteering there? Well, I thought maybe we could do more." Matthew sat down next to her, intrigued. "Tell me more," he encouraged. Over the next hour, Patricia outlined her plan for a community-wide pet adoption fair and fundraiser. She had ideas for games, food stalls, and even a dog agility course. What struck Matthew most was the level of detail in her planning and the enthusiasm with which she spoke. "That sounds incredible, Patricia," Matthew said when she finished. "But it's a big undertaking. Are you sure you're up for it?" Patricia nodded confidently. "I've already talked to Jason, Emily, and Tyler. They're all on board. And I thought maybe you could help us too. If you're not too busy, I mean." Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't long ago that Patricia would barely speak to him, let alone ask for his help on a project. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The Carter House became the unofficial headquarters for Paws for a Cause, as the teens had dubbed their event. Every afternoon, Patricia and her friends would gather around the dining room table, making phone calls, designing posters, and coordinating with local businesses for donations and support. Matthew watched with pride as Patricia took charge, delegating tasks and problem-solving with a maturity that surprised him. Jason put his newly acquired dog training skills to use, organizing a demonstration for the fair. Emily, with her artistic talents, designed eye-catching posters and flyers. Tyler, who had discovered a knack for public speaking, took on the role of reaching out to local media outlets to promote the event. As word spread about Paws for a Cause, the community's response was overwhelmingly positive. Local businesses offered to sponsor various aspects of the fair, from providing food for the concession stands to donating prizes for the games. The mayor even called to commend the teens on their initiative and offer the use of the town square for the event. One evening, as Matthew helped Patricia stuff envelopes with flyers, he couldn't help but marvel at the change in his daughter. "You know, Patricia," he said, a hint of wonder in his voice, "I'm really proud of you. What you and your friends are doing, it's pretty amazing." Patricia paused in her work, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thanks, Dad," she said softly. I want to make things right, you know? After what we did to Goldie and her puppies, it feels good to be helping other animals." Matthew nodded, understanding the mix of guilt and determination that drove his daughter. "You've more than made up for that mistake," he assured her. "You've turned it into something beautiful." As the day of the fair approached, the excitement in Maplewood was palpable. Posters for Paws for a Cause adorned shop windows and community bulletin boards. The local newspaper ran a feature story on the event, complete with a photo of Patricia and her friends with Goldie and the now much larger puppies. The morning of the fair dawned bright and clear. Matthew and Patricia arrived at the town square early to help with setup. The sight that greeted them was nothing short of amazing. Volunteers scurried about, setting up booths and hanging banners. The agility course Jason had designed was taking shape in one corner, while the adoption area was being prepared in another. As Patricia directed volunteers and checked last-minute details, Matthew caught sight of Mrs. Henderson approaching, a basket in her hands. "Matthew, dear," she called out, her face beaming. "I brought some of my famous chocolate chip cookies for the bake sale. And I must say, what these young people have put together is simply marvelous." Matthew smiled warmly at his neighbor. "It really is, isn't it? They've worked so hard." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her eyes following Patricia as she dashed from one task to another. "You know," she said softly, "Sarah would be so proud of both of you." Matthew felt a familiar pang at the mention of his late wife, but it was accompanied by a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That means a lot." As the fair got underway, the town square filled with the sounds of laughter, barking dogs, and excited chatter. Families strolled from booth to booth, children squealed with delight at the puppy kissing booth, and potential adopters spent time getting to know the shelter animals. Patricia and her friends were everywhere at once, solving problems, answering questions, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Matthew watched with pride as his daughter confidently addressed the crowd, sharing Goldie's story and emphasizing the importance of animal welfare and responsible pet ownership. As the day wore on, the success of the event became clear. Several animals found new homes, a substantial amount of money was raised for the shelter, and perhaps most importantly, The community had come together in a way that hadn't been seen in years. Towards the end of the fair, Matthew found Patricia sitting on a bench near the adoption area, Sunny curled up at her feet. The puppy, now nearly full-grown, had become Patricia's constant companion. "How are you holding up?" Matthew asked, sitting down next to her. Patricia leaned against her father's shoulder, a tired but happy smile on her face. "I can't believe we actually pulled this off," she said. "It's been amazing, Dad. Did you see how many people came?" Matthew nodded, putting an arm around his daughter. "I did. You should be very proud, Patricia. You've made a real difference today." As they sat there, taking in the scene around them, the local veterinarian, Dr. Anderson, approached. "Patricia," she said, her face beaming, "I just wanted to congratulate you and your friends. This event has been a tremendous success. In fact, I was wondering if you'd be interested in making this an annual thing." Patricia's eyes widened. "Really? You think we could do this every year?" Dr. Anderson nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. And if you're interested, I'd love to have you and your friends volunteer at the clinic. We could always use help with the animals, and you've all shown such dedication and compassion." As Patricia excitedly accepted the offer, Matthew felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The journey that had begun with a terrible mistake had led to this moment of growth, compassion, and community spirit. Later that evening, as they were cleaning up the last of the fair, Jason approached Matthew, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice serious, "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything." Matthew raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What do you mean, Jason?" The teenager shuffled his feet, searching for the right words. "When you first made us take care of Goldie and the puppies, I thought it was the worst punishment ever. But it changed me. Changed all of us, really. You could have just reported us to the police, but instead, you gave us a chance to make things right. To become better people." Matthew was touched by Jason's words. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You did the hard work, Jason. All of you did. I just provided the opportunity." As Jason nodded and walked away to help his friends, Matthew reflected on the incredible journey they had all been on. From that fateful night at the railroad tracks to this successful community event, they had all grown and changed in ways he never could have imagined. The compassion that had started with caring for Goldie and her puppies had rippled outward, touching not just Patricia and her friends, but the entire community of Maplewood. It was a powerful reminder of the impact that small acts of kindness and responsibility could have. As the last of the fairgoers left and the sun began to set, Matthew gathered Patricia and her friends together. "I just want to say," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "how incredibly proud I am of all of you. What you've accomplished here today goes far beyond raising money or finding homes for animals. You've brought this community together and shown everyone the power of compassion and second chances." The teens beamed with pride, exhausted but exhilarated by the day's events. As they stood there, Goldie and Sunny at their feet, Matthew knew that this was just the beginning. The compassion that had grown in these young hearts would continue to flourish, touching more lives and inspiring others to make a difference. As they walked home that evening, Patricia linked her arm through her father's. "Dad," she said softly, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Matthew squeezed his daughter's arm, his heart full. "Oh, sweetheart," he replied, his voice gentle, "she would be beyond proud. Just like I am." The streets of Maplewood were quiet as they made their way home, but the air was filled with a sense of possibility and hope. The compassion that had taken root in their hearts had grown into something beautiful, something that would continue to bloom and spread, touching lives and changing their community for the better. The weeks following the successful Pause for a Cause event flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Patricia and her friends found themselves busier than ever, balancing their newfound responsibilities at Dr. Anderson's clinic with their schoolwork and the ongoing care of Goldie and her puppies. The Carter house remained a hub of energy and purpose, filled with the sounds of excited teenagers planning their next animal welfare project and the playful barks of the growing puppies. As the day approached for Goldie and her puppies to be put up for adoption, a bittersweet atmosphere settled over the household. The teens had grown deeply attached to the dogs, and the thought of saying goodbye was proving more difficult than any of them had anticipated. One evening, as Matthew was helping Patricia prepare dinner, he noticed his daughter's unusually quiet demeanor. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently, pausing in his task of chopping vegetables. Patricia sighed, setting down the pot she had been stirring. I can't believe it's almost time for Goldie and the puppies to be adopted," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I know it's what we've been working towards all this time, but it's hard to let them go," Matthew finished for her, understanding in his eyes. Patricia nodded, blinking back tears. "Yeah. Especially Sonny. I mean, I know we can't keep them all, but..." Matthew put down his knife and pulled his daughter into a hug. "I know, sweetheart. It's okay to feel sad about it. These dogs have been a big part of our lives for months now." As they stood there in the kitchen, Goldie padded in, her tail wagging gently. She nuzzled Patricia's hand, as if sensing her distress. Patricia knelt down, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. "We've come a long way, haven't we, girl?" she murmured into Goldie's fur. Matthew watched the scene with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. He remembered the scared, angry teenager Patricia had been just a few months ago, and marveled at the compassionate, responsible young woman she had become. The next morning, Patricia called an emergency meeting with her friends. They gathered in the Carter living room, surrounded by the now familiar chaos of dog toys and puppy paraphernalia. "Guys," Patricia began, her face serious, "I've been thinking. The adoption day for Goldie and the puppies is coming up, and, well, I think we need to make sure they go to the absolute best homes possible." Jason nodded vigorously. "Definitely. After everything we've been through with them, we can't just hand them over to anyone." Emily, always the practical one, pulled out a notebook. "Maybe we could come up with a screening process? Like, a questionnaire for potential adopters?" Tyler's face lit up. "Oh. And we could do home visits too, to make sure the dogs are going to good environments." As the teens bounced ideas off each other, their enthusiasm growing with each suggestion, Matthew listened from the kitchen doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. The level of thought and care they were putting into this process was truly heartwarming. Over the next few days, the group threw themselves into preparations for the adoption event. They created detailed questionnaires, planned home visits, and even put together information packets on each of the dogs, complete with photos and personality descriptions. The morning of the adoption event dawned bright and clear. The local community center, where they had decided to hold the event, was a hive of activity as Patricia and her friends set everything up. Goldie and her puppies, now nearly full-grown, were settled into comfortable pens, each adorned with colorful signs describing the dog's personality and needs. As people began to arrive, Matthew watched with pride as Patricia confidently greeted potential adopters, clipboard in hand. She guided them through the questionnaire process with patience and enthusiasm, taking the time to answer questions and share stories about each of the dogs. Jason had set up a small demonstration area where he showcased some of the training he had done with Goldie, impressing onlookers with her newfound skills. Emily manned a booth filled with educational materials about responsible pet ownership, while Tyler used his public speaking skills to make announcements and keep the event running smoothly. As the day wore on, Matthew found himself getting emotional as he watched families bond with the dogs. A young couple fell in love with one of the puppies, laughing as it showered them with kisses. An elderly gentleman sat for over an hour with another, the two seeming to form an instant connection. Midway through the event, Dr. Anderson arrived, beaming as she took in the scene. "Patricia," she called out, making her way through the crowd. "This is incredible. I can't believe how well organized everything is." Patricia blushed at the praise. "Thanks, Dr. Anderson. We just wanted to make sure the dogs found the best possible homes." As they chatted, Matthew noticed a familiar face entering the community center. It was Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor whose dog had been the initial target of the teens' ill-fated prank all those months ago. Patricia tensed as she saw Mrs. Johnson approach, but to everyone's surprise, the older woman's face bore a warm smile. "Patricia, dear," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice kind. "I just wanted to come and see what all the fuss was about. And I must say, I'm impressed." Patricia stuttered for a moment before finding her voice. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. We've worked really hard on this." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her eyes twinkling. I can see that. You know, I've been watching you and your friends these past few months. The change in all of you, well, it's quite remarkable. As Patricia and Mrs. Johnson continued to talk, Matthew felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Jason standing there, an uncharacteristically serious look on his face. Mr. Carter, Jason began, his voice low. We've been talking, and, well, we were wondering if maybe you'd consider adopting Sonny. Matthew blinked in surprise. Me? But I thought. Jason rushed on. We know Patricia's really attached to him, and after everything you've done for us, we just thought it might be nice, you know? For both of you. Before Matthew could respond, he felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Patricia standing beside him, her eyes shining with hope. Please, Dad, she whispered. I know we can't keep them all, but Sonny, he feels like family now. Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. He looked around at the faces of Patricia and her friends, then over at Sonny, who was watching them with his tail wagging hopefully. Well, Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion, I guess we do have room for one more in our family. The cheer that went up from the teens drew curious looks from around the room, but Matthew didn't care. The joy on his daughter's face was all that mattered. As the day drew to a close, all of the dogs had found loving homes. Goldie was adopted by a family with young children, who promised to bring her back for visits. The other puppies went to equally wonderful homes, each adoption feeling like a small miracle. After the last of the adopters had left, Patricia and her friends gathered around Sonny, who was now officially a permanent member of the Carter family. There were tears and laughter as they said their goodbyes to the other dogs, each teen taking a moment to give Goldie one last hug before she left with her new family. As they cleaned up the community center, there was a sense of both accomplishment and nostalgia in the air. This chapter of their lives was coming to a close, but the impact it had had on all of them was undeniable. Later that evening, as Matthew and Patricia sat on their back porch, Sonny curled up at their feet, Patricia turned to her father. Dad, she said softly, do you think we made a difference? Not just for Goldie and the puppies, but, you know, in general? Matthew smiled, putting an arm around his daughter's shoulders. Patricia, I think you and your friends have made more of a difference than you realize. You've shown this whole town the power of compassion, responsibility, and second chances. That's no small thing. Patricia leaned into her father's embrace, a contented smile on her face. I'm glad we got to keep Sonny, she murmured. It feels right, somehow. Like he was meant to be part of our family all along. As the sun set over Maplewood, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Matthew reflected on the journey they had all been on. From that terrible night at the railroad tracks to this moment of peace and new beginnings, it had been a transformative experience for everyone involved. The mistake that could have ended in tragedy had instead become a catalyst for growth, compassion, and community. Patricia and her friends had not only redeemed themselves but had also inspired others to be more caring and involved. As Sonny let out a contented sigh at their feet, Matthew knew that while this chapter was ending, a new one was just beginning. The lessons learned, the bonds formed, and the compassion cultivated would continue to shape their lives and the life of their community for years to come. The story of Goldie and her puppies had started with an act of cruelty but had blossomed into a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love and responsibility. As Matthew hugged his daughter close, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. In the quiet of the evening, with the gentle sounds of their neighborhood settling down for the night, Matthew, Patricia, and Sonny sat together, a family made whole again through the most unexpected of circumstances. And in homes across Maplewood, other families were welcoming their new four-legged members, each adoption a small ripple in the wave of compassion that had swept through their town. The road ahead might not always be easy, but they would face it together, with open hearts and a newfound appreciation for the difference that even the smallest acts of kindness could make. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Matthew knew that this was not an ending, but a beautiful new beginning for all of them.